Welcome to the Professional Investment Podcast. I'm Charlotte Moore, award-winning journalist and founder of Moore Squared Communications. Each episode, we welcome a guest to the show to share their news story of the week, and I'm delighted to welcome Jo Sharples, Chief Investment Officer of DC Solutions at Aon, to the show today. Welcome, Jo.
Thanks, Charlotte, and great to be on the show.
Lovely to have you. Do tell us, what is your news story of the week?
So my news story of the week is pension managers urge the UK to ditch mega fund scale test, and it was published on the FT on Monday the 13th of January.
What is it about this story that made you want to choose it as your news story of the week? Because I know that we felt like there were just so many different stories we could have chosen. There's lots of news going on.
Yeah, so it was a tough one, but there were two things for me that really made this one stand out. The first is that just the topic is so topical. And I think if we look across the industry, it's a consultation that has garnered interest from sort of almost every aspect of the pension industry, which I think is quite unusual. A lot of consultations tend to be quite niche, but they're often aimed at a particular subset of the industry. This one, no matter who I talk to, they've all got a view on it, and it sort of touches everybody, whether you're a pension provider, whether you're an employer or an asset manager or a consultant or a lawyer, sort of the list goes on in terms of who's interested. And the second piece for me was really that we've got so many different views on the matter. And again, often when you look at consultations, and I've been involved with quite a few over the years, is that they're often sort of the culmination of a conversation with government and everyone's sort of broadly aligned. With this one, it feels like the views are so very different, and there's people on both sides of the argument with kind of quite opposing views. And I think the article really captured a lot of those differences for me, which are the two reasons why I sort of picked it out.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, in this article, we're sort of talking just about DC consolidation, and the government is talking about consolidation across all pension schemes. So that's also the LGPS and the DP schemes as well. But even within DC consolidation, there's an awful lot to talk about and to unpack. So let's do that stage by stage. Let's talk about master trust, which is obviously something that's close to your heart because you're CIO for the Aon's master trust. What are the implications for consolidation in the master trust space?
Yeah, if we think about the whole scale question and some of the benefits or not of scale, we see there's a number of benefits of having that greater scale. It comes through in terms of member experience. So actually, arguably, if you've got bigger scale, more resources, you can offer a better experience. It can also come through in the investment. So speaking from experience, the more assets under management you've got, you can then go to asset managers and you can negotiate a better fee rate, or you can get more flexibility. So that might be to create a bespoke strategy or have something tailored for you. Now, I think what's quite interesting is that there's probably a minimum level where you can do that. And looking at the market, I think a lot of schemes are probably already there. So arguably sort of any increase in scale above that actually comes with more marginal benefits. I think if we look at the opposite side of that, larger schemes, actually there are some disadvantages of running a larger scheme. You've got potentially more members to think about, so actually it's harder to run bespoke services. Things have to be a bit more streamlined. Also, if you want to put through a big change, actually it's going to touch so many more people, so you have to be very thoughtful about it. Might take a bit longer. And even on the investment side, there comes a point where having a lot of assets means you have to think very carefully about how you invest those assets so you don't move the market or incur too much in transaction costs. It might even start to limit some of the opportunities you can look at, because actually you need opportunities and investments of a certain size to start moving the dial. So there are all these sort of pros and cons to think about. Personally, I don't think there's a right level in there, and that's where it's quite interesting with this consultation. I think it depends a lot on how you're set up, how you think about life as a provider. And I do think there's different ways of getting scale, whether that's using sort of shared platforms or whether it's using pooled funds. I think pooled funds were named, that their name came from that very fact that you're sort of pooling across investors. So actually there's a lot of ways to get the scale without necessarily having to be big yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, because if we take it quite literally, what the government has said is they want no provider to be less than 25 billion. So that would mean at the moment that there's only 2 master trusts that qualify. And that, what does that mean? That everybody else below has to merge or squish together or go out of the marketplace altogether? So I think there is a point, isn't there, about innovation and size. There is a reason why asset managers, when they have funds, they set them at certain limits and then they close them, because of your point. It does become more difficult to invest the larger you become, and certain asset classes become out of your bounds, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've all come across active funds that have closed due to capacity limits, and I think that's a really key point to consider. I suspect for the DC industry, because we've used a lot of passive funds, actually that may be less of an issue, because actually there's an awful lot of capacity in passive funds. But even so, if you're changing your strategic asset allocation, you need to think about how does that impact on the market. Could you even move the market, but also do you incur bigger transaction costs as a result? So there's a bit of care needed, and I think you're quite right. If you take it very literally and use scale as a blunt instrument, you're left with a very, very small market, which doesn't feel that innovative. And I think that competition, I think everyone agrees that the competition, whether you're big or small, actually it's really healthy and it's really good for sort of driving innovation, and that's sort of what next in terms of investment strategy, the member experience.
Yes, exactly. You want people to take different views. You don't want them to choose between 6 different yogurts that are still vanilla flavoured after all, right?
Ideally not. And it's good for everybody. I think it's good for the market, for employers, for members, but it's also good for, I think, the industry, because actually for the market, if you've got a lot of very concentrated asset owners, it does create sort of systemic risk that perhaps we haven't seen before. So there's a lot of care needed with some of this.
And we're seeing sort of an echo of that really on the buyout side in DB market, with so many assets going into the insurance market. So there is an echo of systemic risk as everybody gets funneled into sort of the same type of asset class. Putting aside master trust, because as you said when you opened why you chose this news story is because everybody has an opinion on it. So hopefully the views of this podcast will be off the charts. Master trust is only but one part of the DC market, because we like to keep it nice and complex here in the UK, nice and fragmented. Many companies choose, or have chosen in the past, not to use a master trust, and not obviously to build their own trustee-based scheme, but instead to outsource their pension to what can be known as a wonderful bit of jargon, a GPP, a group personal protection, and those plans are usually run by insurers. Now, there's a weird sort of contrast here about consolidation within this space, isn't there? Because on the one hand, you have lots of companies that may be using those insurance companies for a small number of employees, but within that provider, they can obviously consolidate the assets and be quite efficient. So is there anything that needs to be done in this portion of the market about consolidation for, say, current auto-enroll pension schemes?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and we sort of step into the other half of the DC market, which is that contract-based world. I think if you start at a very high level, in terms of the number of contract-based providers, there aren't that many. So arguably you might say, let's not bother with consolidating them. And also their regulatory regime is slightly different, because they fall under the FCA remit rather than pension regulator. So they have kind of slightly different regulations to navigate. When you start looking down within an individual contract-based scheme, you then start to see lots of that fragmentation you talked about, and it's quite interesting when you look at the investment choices. So for example, if you take a typical provider, they might have a main default now, but equally they might have many legacy defaults and also bespoke defaults that a client might have put in place 10-15 years ago. Whether or not those are up to date is probably questionable. And then you've got much bigger fund ranges, so often people get tempted out to go into the bigger fund range. So when you start to look underneath, that contract-based arrangement might be really big, but actually when you look down at the funds they're using, it's really fragmented, so they're not really getting that scale underneath. So I do think that market is probably ripe for consolidation, perhaps within individual providers. But one of the challenges we've got at the moment is it's really difficult to do that, because it's a sort of quirk of contract-based legislation that you can't move people without consent because they're group individual policy. So you need that member consent. We all know people aren't engaged. They don't read the bits of paper that you send them or the emails that you send them. So getting that consent, that buy-in to make a change is hard. So that's the other bit of the consultation, is looking at how to, I say streamline that, but how to introduce sort of non-consent based transfers in that contract based world, which I think if that gets off the ground could be really beneficial in allowing providers to consolidate, to combine assets, and then to actually get the scale to do things. Even if you're not talking about that scale, it offers the potential simply to move people from old defaults that have perhaps had their day to something that's a bit more modern and is kind of reflective of the time. So from a kind of member outcome perspective, it feels like that could be super positive.
Yeah, and I mean, I know I chaired a round table where we talked about this, and you mentioned at the beginning that some of the people that are interested in chatting about this consolidation are lawyers. And obviously, I think they're particularly interested about this, how we get round this contract clause that's preventing us from actually, as you outlined there, two things: making sure people who are currently employed and amassing wealth in their pension pots have the best possible access to the best possible investment strategies, and that can be adjusted over time, which of course you're going to need to do, plus all of these legacy schemes, which I don't think anybody can put a number on, but there were a number of DC schemes that were opened in the 1990s as DB pensions were falling away. They tend to be more concentrated in certain industries, like within financial services and the pharmaceutical sector, but they do exist. And if they have been sort of set back in the 1990s and not touched, that is not fit for purpose. So it's this consolidation question is like a very complicated wool sweater. If you pull one thread, it just becomes more and more complicated to unravel.
It is, and it's a huge prize, but equally there's probably quite a lot of work to get to that kind of ultimate goal. And I don't know, it's really hard to put a kind of a number on how many sort of different defaults we're looking at, but I've heard people talk about figures in the hundreds, and that's just for a single provider. So it could be a lot of work to kind of get it straight.
Yeah, well, a single provider with 100 defaults, that makes me want to lie down in a darkened room just thinking about it, to be honest, Jo. Do you think then, at the moment, that the focus on consolidation is in the right area? Should we, weirdly enough, not actually be so worried about auto-enroll pension schemes, but think about the legacy schemes to tidy up first? Or should we take a focus away from the master trust, because there has been consolidation in that market? We went back to our discussion about there only being two that qualify, and kind of let that market evolve. Should the focus of consolidation really only be on the GPP or the insurance-led market? Yeah,
I mean, I think our kind of stance all along is it's got to be about the member, and anything you do around consolidation has to be in sort of the best interest of members and actually give them better results. I think if we start talking about legacy schemes, whether they're sort of legacy trust-based schemes or legacy contract-based schemes, I think there's definite scope to do that. And I think arguably, I say the prize, and different people will probably have different views on this, but the prize in terms of delivering better outcomes for people is probably greatest there, because actually if you can shift them from something old, ancient, and that needs refreshing to something much more modern and reflective of where we are in the kind of market, that's a huge win. I'd say we are sort of starting to see it happen, because you've obviously got what's happening in the master trust market with trust-based schemes moving on. I think that's going to continue. There's lots of legislation that's sort of prompting that. You've got all the value for members assessment, and that's starting to come through. And if you look at numbers from the regulator in terms of how many trust-based schemes are left, actually it's come down quite a lot. So I think my inclination would be just to let that run and let that market evolve. I think what's proposed in terms of allowing transfers without consent for the contract-based market will help to consolidate some of that, because I suspect there will be people who are probably quite frustrated that they can't do it, and actually this will unlock some of those frustrations. I think I was kind of reflecting on some of this earlier, and I think one other challenge we possibly see is there are some obstacles to consolidating as well, particularly when you think about legacy trust-based schemes, particularly schemes that have got guarantees built into them. So there is still quite a number of sort of occupational trust-based schemes that have got these hidden gems, whether it's a sort of GMP underpin or guaranteed investment return. They're all very valuable for members, but they're quite hard to administer. They're quite complicated to communicate, and they also stop schemes from consolidating. So that's one of my worries, is that you might have a kind of small pocket of members who've got that valuable guarantee, and the rest of them can't move because of it. And I think that's a challenge in terms of, probably as an industry, we need to think around solutions to actually unlock some of that and make it possible.
Yep, and the UK pensions world is never simple, and it always gets more complex.
It isn't. We keep trying to map it out, and it gets very, very difficult as well.
Yeah. If we take a further step back, I mean, we've talked about consolidation, but if we think about what we're actually trying to achieve with consolidation, I mean, the whole purpose of a pension is to provide the best possible retirement for the members. And I wonder if we've got a bit sidetracked by focusing so much on consolidation, and whether we should not be focusing a bit more on investment, which also neatly ties into the name of this podcast, which is the Professional Investment Podcast. We always like to bring things back to investment. So are we thinking too much about consolidation and not enough about investment when it comes to what DC members really need?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that. And I would say it's got to be investment every time. And I always think I do worry, and I kind of share your concerns, that I think somewhere that focus on member outcomes, delivering returns for them, sort of gets lost in all the talk about consolidation. And I think we've got to be really careful not to lose sight of that, because the sort of link that's being touted is that once you get to a certain scale, it means you can deliver great outcomes for members. I don't think that's guaranteed at all. So if we look at the performance, you've got some quite small schemes delivering really great performance, you've got some quite big schemes delivering not so great performance. So you've got a real mix, and there's definitely not a link that we can see between having more scale means you deliver better outcomes. So I think we have to be really careful not to fall into that trap. And I was again thinking about what drives those outcomes, and probably what do those schemes have in common. I do think a lot of it comes back to your mindset, so how you think about investment for members, your culture that's behind that, and also you've got to have resources at your disposal to have the expertise to do that. So it feels like those factors are probably bigger drivers of returns and outcomes than scale on its own. I mean, you've got to have a certain amount of scale, but I think the certain amount of scale is probably up for debate. But I think it's those other factors that will have the bigger impact.
Yeah. And it was, we said at the beginning of this show, we really had a long conversation, you and I, about what the news story was going to be, because there was so many different news stories to choose from. And although we obviously want to talk about one news story a week, there was another quite interesting news story out this week that People's Pension would be allocating £4 billion to private markets. And I wondered, keeping to our theme of investment and how we need to really focus on that for members' happy retirements, what is that telling us about how DC investment is evolving?
Yeah, I mean, this was probably my second choice story, so I'm glad we've got onto this. But I think this was, I think the real significance of this, and sort of people's announcements comes after Nest has been doing private assets for a while. Also, you've got Smart and Cushion in the same space who followed. But for me, it's really saying that actually private assets is here. It's going to form a big part of these schemes' default strategies. It's in the default. It's not a sort of secondary afterthought, and it's sort of here to stay. So I think, from my perspective, that's really positive in terms of people getting on board with it and it becoming sort of more mainstream and acceptable. And I think as well, because we've had these commitments, it signals to the broader industry that actually DC is serious about this, and we're going to make it happen, and actually we're going to need the innovation from the asset management community to have product solutions to facilitate that. And I think that will be really good for innovation. It will be really good for hopefully unblocking any of the sort of remaining obstacles in terms of what platforms can do, how we think about fees, etc. So I see that all as hugely positive and sort of setting the way for great things in terms of DC investment strategy and bringing in private assets. I'm a big fan personally. I think they've got the potential to really enhance returns has to be done well and thoughtfully so we can benefit from them. But I think if we can do it right, it's huge potential for extra value, extra return for members.
And where does that, because there are, I mean, I know that we have the government massively in favour of private assets because they see it as a way of trying to bolster investment in the UK when the UK economy is obviously stuttering. But to address the cynics out there that maybe think that private assets, I mean, the most cynical description I ever got given of private equity was that it was just the small cap effect with an unknown price tag that you could never value because you don't look at it that often. So
that's very cynical.
What is it that private markets give us that public markets don't? And is it worth us pursuing in this context?
Yeah, and I think for me, there's a couple of things. One is entity set, so there are lots of companies that have chosen not to list or have listed and have then chosen to delist, and actually it's providing access to those companies and allowing you to invest in there. So you have got that broader opportunity set. With it, you get more diversification. I think you've got the potential for increased returns, but also some of the assets we're talking about have got really nice sort of inflation characteristics, which fit very well with actually what we're trying to deliver for members. And then, of course, there's the sustainability impact. So if you're actually holding an asset, if you're privately holding an asset, arguably you've got more potential to engage and to sort of influence actually that sort of the footprint, but the impact that business has on the world. So I think those are all sort of very valuable attributes.
Yeah, I think that's fair. If we then we stay on this investment theme, and if we think about the investment priorities for DC, if we don't get too hung up on what exactly we should be doing around consolidation, do you think there should be a greater emphasis? Maybe we should move some of the government's emphasis away from consolidation and towards value for money, because that seems to be what you're touching on there with that discussion of private assets and all the different aspects that they can give you beyond passive equities just being incredibly cheap and rising because of Trump and the Magnificent Seven.
Yeah. I mean, I think every day it should be value, and so I think if that was my one ask, that would be an amazing vision, wouldn't it, to have decisions made on value and it's focused on net returns and not cost and not scale, but all about value and what you deliver for members. I think that would be hugely positive. I think it's happening, and I think the market's starting to move that way, and I've had encouraging conversations with clients and sort of others in the industry, but I think things like that take time, and we've come from an environment where actually cost was everything, and now we've got to shift it. So I think there's a lot that as the industry will need to do to sort of help that, to educate along the way to and actually demonstrate the value. And that's why I think it's key when we do start going into private assets that actually we do it really well, so that people actually see the value coming out of it, because that's almost the worst that can happen is you make a decision in haste and then repent at it, and actually clients go, well, I told you so, look, you never should have done it. And I think that would be really bad. So I think that's why it's so important to take a bit of time and to do your due diligence when looking at this. But yeah, definitely value every time.
Yeah, I mean, again, obviously we're back to our chunky sweater that's quite difficult to unravel.
It is.
But even
like
value
layers of chunky sweater.
Yeah, even if we're thinking about value for money, we think that might be that could be quite straightforward. For example, we could think it just could be about performance. But we've seen the Australian superannuation schemes getting themselves into a bit of a muddle where they're looking at quite short-term performance, and yet they're investing multi-decade. So that's something else we need to navigate. And you talked about education and communication. The other issue, of course, as well, is often the people who are buying pension schemes are people from HR departments who are not financial people, they're not investment professionals, so they don't necessarily have that know-how. Is there something more that needs to be done, or is it about legislation helping to push people in the right direction, or a bit of both?
I wondered if it's a bit of both, because when we talk to kind of prospective clients, you've got people from HR teams. You often have procurement teams as well. Mm-hmm. So actually, some of the things they're used to buying on might be quite different. Pension probably is quite it's quite distinct from many of the other benefits they provide, and it can be quite complicated. So I do think cost has always been it's quite a blunt, but it's very easy. So everyone sort of understands the cost, and you can put it in pounds and pence. So from that perspective, it's been a very easy way to differentiate. And I think if we want people to differentiate more on, say, performance or the client service or the member experience and those sort of I think we'll need to help them and actually make it easy. I was going to say some of them are less tangible. Arguably, investment performance is very tangible, that it would be a mix, but I do think there's a bit of help needed. So some of it could come from government saying, yeah, you've got to look at this and this and this, but other of it's, I think, probably as an industry, we've sort of, I say, got to help ourselves, but make it easy for people. And I think it will happen, but we're coming out of an environment where sort of cost has been everything. It's been in all the bulk transfer regulations, it's been in, you've had your charge cap, you've had all that focus, and now you're having to sort of unravel your under sweater to get to the value piece.
Yeah, we might have got some somewhat tortured metaphors, but to add to the tortured metaphor, I like years and years ago I always said, pensions is not jam tomorrow, it's going out to buy the orange seeds today, to plant the grove, to harvest the oranges, to make the marmalade. It is that far in the future. Absolutely. Particularly when we're talking about DC, when you could be onboarding somebody who's right at the start of their career, is only 21 years old, and you've got 4 decades to invest for. So there's definitely some deep thought that needs to go on into how we create.
It's so worthwhile getting it right.
Exactly, and I'm not sure that we necessarily will know the answer, and we will be able to have to flex and change it and be a bit sort of agile about it as we go through.
Yeah, I suspect we will, and there'll be some things that we try that just don't work or don't resonate, and then we'll have to have a think and come up with a different way forward. But I think we'll get there. I think it's that journey's already started, and that's why some of the the headline you mentioned about people's pension allocating, I think that's so exciting, because it's that's momentum building. And I think it feels like what's the word? It's almost like an oil tanker. Oil tanker is probably not the right description I'm looking for, but it sort of started, and actually it's going to take, it's got that momentum. It will take time to get there, but it will definitely get there.
And I think that makes a great point for us to end our discussion. Thank you, Jo, for coming onto the show, for sharing your news story of the week. In fact, we sort of snuck in a second one there too. And for all of your insights and expertise and knowledge. It's much appreciated.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Really enjoyed today.
Great. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you never want to miss a future episode. Please do interact with us, engage below, and do take part in the Spotify poll, which will be out with each episode in this second series. Thank you for listening.